There it goes. Recording in progress. First off, I want to say, thank you for taking the interest in coming out. What we do in town government, always, transparency is a big deal. The Freedom of Information Act is something that could be, your best friend or your worst enemy. It's one of those things where, we need to be transparent for the public, but also understand the rules of engagement from our side, what we can and can't do, what the public's entitled to. So sometimes it can be a tricky wicket. So I think with, especially the new folks in the room who are new to boards, this is a great opportunity to learn more about it. Please ask questions. We have tonight with us Russell Blair. Now, Russell's been, I'll let him tell you about himself, but I met him years ago when he was in the journalism world. And I've interacted with him, oh my gosh, like dozens of times over the last year when I've had questions about FOI issues, how the FOI law works. And he's a great resource, along with Tom Hennick, who's up there. Is Tom still there?
He retired at the end of the
year.
He did retire.
Oh man, I didn't even know that yet. So you're it.
Yes.
You're it for the state. Okay. So please give him your attention. And it's like I said, it's a great opportunity. I'm going to hang around the back of the room for a few minutes, but I got to go over to Stony Hill. I'm helping swear in the officers tonight for the fire department. So otherwise, I would have been here and engaged with you. So anyway, enjoy. Russell, thank you for coming in.
Yep, thank you. Good to be here.
And, we really appreciate it.
Of course. So thank you, Dan, for the introduction. As you said, I'm Russell Blair. I'm Director of Education and Communications at the Freedom of Information Commission. Before I did this, I was a journalist for about a dozen years, covering local government, state government, boards, commissions, all that. I've been there at those town council meetings that go until midnight or 11 o'clock, and I understand the commitment that takes. So I thank you again for coming out tonight to learn more about the Freedom of Information Act. Some of you, if you're new to a board or commission, maybe somebody asked you to run, somebody appointed you. You've got all this information coming at you, and FOI could just seem like one more thing we have to learn about. But I hope that today you get some practical advice, we'll give you some tips to help you understand, answer any questions that you may have, and that you leave here. We don't expect you to be an expert in FOI, but you have enough of a knowledge of it that it isn't this scary thing. It's not this burdensome thing that you're worried about, that you know what you need to do to run your meetings, you know what you need to do. If you get a records request, you know what your rights are under FOI. That's important too. There are limitations, what some records people are not entitled to. So we'll talk a little bit about all that. Again, this is a small enough group here. If you have a question as I'm going, just raise your hand and I'll call on you, just so we can make sure if there's something we want to talk more about, we address that. Whenever I do a presentation like this, I just take 30 seconds to talk a little bit about the history of FOI. If you don't know, this has been the law in Connecticut since 1975. Goes back to Ella Grasso was the governor at the time. So we're talking almost 50 years that this has been the law in Connecticut. And what makes Connecticut unique is that in some other states, there's an open records law, but if your records are denied or, you're denied access to a meeting, you have to hire an attorney, you have to pay fees, you have to go to court, you have to sue, it could be a years-long process. In Connecticut, if somebody has a complaint about the Freedom of Information Act, whether it's a meeting, they were denied access to a meeting, the agenda wasn't correct, the minutes weren't filed, or it's a records request, their request was denied, they believe that, there were too many redactions in the records that they were seeking, it's taking the agency too long. In Connecticut, we have a commission that exists, and the only thing we do, where I work, the only thing we do is we handle complaints about the Freedom of Information Act. We're almost like the state police for just freedom of information. We get between 600 and 700 complaints a year. And again, the reason we do these trainings is so you guys have the tools that you need so that you're not having to worry about somebody filing a complaint. You know what you need to do for your agendas. You know what you need to do for minutes. If you do Zoom meetings, we can talk about that. What are the parameters for that? But just, I think it's important to know the way we operate. So we're not out there enforcing, we're not going through every town and checking the meeting agendas and all that. But if somebody finds something that is, that they believe is wrong, they can file a complaint, and potentially you could have to come to Hartford and come to a hearing, and we want to avoid all that. So as I said, the Connecticut is unique in that we have this commission that settles these complaints, and really there's two general areas of FOI that we'll cover tonight: the meetings piece and the records piece. And freedom of information, the name is a little bit of a misnomer. It's not people's opportunity to ask you unlimited questions. It's not about, asking a board or commission, why did you do this, or who did this, or who authorized that. Really, it's about access to meetings, and it's about access to public records. So the public has a right to attend your meetings, to watch you guys in action, listen to you make decisions, hear your deliberations. And then they have a right to any records that you may be using to inform that, whether it's, budget records, it could be a report that your board or commission asks the town to do. It could be communications between, board members and other board members, or board members and town staff. So really it's an access law. A couple things, that I always like to talk about with meetings as the first part. Again, it's access to meetings. Number one question I get about meetings is public comment. People all the time will ask me about public comment. Do people have a right under Freedom of Information to speak at a meeting? And the answer is no. It's about observing the meeting. It's sitting there. It's listening. Your boards and commissions set your own rules for public comment. Many towns do have public comment. I think it's great if you do that, but know that you're in control of that. You can limit it to certain items on the agenda. You can limit the time that people can speak. If you have a meeting that's going on and on and on, and you need to limit public comment on that night, you're okay under FOI. It's about allowing people to, come to your meetings and listen. Another question we get about meetings in terms of FOI is, people say, well, if I speak at the meeting, do I have a right to be included in the minutes? The answer to that is no. We'll talk more about minutes later, but I just want you to know it's about people's right to attend the meeting. They don't get to be in the minutes. If they give you guys documents at the meeting, you don't have to attach those to the minutes. It's just their right to be there and to listen to you deliberate and make those decisions and take your votes and all that. Sometimes people ask who's covered by Freedom of Information. In a case like this, it's pretty easy. You guys are all, you work for the town, you're on a board or commission. The one important thing I like to highlight, though, is subcommittees, because sometimes people get tripped up on this. If you're on a board or commission and you create a subcommittee, that subcommittee is a new public agency under FOI, and that subcommittee, you still do it needs to do its own agendas, its own minutes. The meetings are open. We'll talk later about quorums, because that's a really important part for FOI about what makes a meeting. But if you create a subcommittee, it's a new public agency, and all the same rules apply. The way to think of it is you can't delegate away your FOI obligations. If your office is covered by FOI, if your board is covered by FOI, if you create an entity from that, subcommittee, a task force, a working group, whatever you call it, if you're creating a new entity, you still have to follow all the rules for FOI. So I just think that's important to know, because sometimes people, can get a little tripped up on that. So as I said, we'll start with meetings, and I think it's important to read from the FOI Act the definition of a meeting, because there's a few pieces of it that I think are important for you all to know. So in the law, a meeting is defined, and this is a public meeting under FOI, is defined as any hearing or other proceeding of a public agency, any convening or assembly of a quorum of a multi-member public agency, and any communication by or to a quorum of a multi-member public agency, whether in person or by means of electronic equipment, to discuss or act upon a matter over which the public agency has supervision, control, jurisdiction, or advisory power. So that's a mouthful. There's a lot there, but we'll break it down into a few things. The first thing, you heard it in there a couple of times, is quorum. That's really, really important. That's really mainly the determining factor for what makes a meeting, is if you have a quorum of your board or commission together. So you should be thinking, whenever a quorum of your board is together, and again, there was that second piece in there, whether in person or by means of electronic equipment. So it doesn't matter if you're talking on the phone, if you're emailing, if you're texting, if you're on Facebook group chat together, if a quorum of the board is together and you're talking about board business, you need to be doing that in a meeting that has been publicly noticed. I'll talk a little bit about email, because that's a common thing that we run into, especially in this day and age. What's interesting is that piece about meetings can be electronic was in the law back in 1975. What they were concerned about back then was people getting on the phone, the chairman calling up all the members, lining up all the votes ahead of the meeting, and then you get to the meeting and there's not really any discussion, and it seems like it's been predetermined. And I've covered public meetings where it often seems like that's the case. Everyone sort of has a game plan. They come in, and then the public doesn't really get to hear that discussion and that deliberation, and to start to understand, why did the board decide to do this? What were people thinking? So it's important to know with email, just sending an email to your whole board or commission, that in and of itself doesn't make it an illegal meeting. What makes it an illegal meeting is if people start responding, they're weighing in, they're giving their points of view, they're discussing. Certainly if anyone's trying to vote over email, you can't vote over email. I see it sometimes where people come to the meeting and they say, well, we've talked over email before and we decided to never do that. You can send an email as sort of an FYI communication. Maybe you saw an article in the newspaper, you want to share it with your fellow board members. Maybe one board member has a proposal that they want to add to the agenda. Maybe you're on the Planning and Zoning Commission and you have some ideas. I know the hot topic now is affordable housing. Maybe you have some ideas for what the town could do. You could share a proposal if you wait to discuss it at the next board meeting. So if you're sharing those types of things, the line should be, look, I'm sharing this for your knowledge, but let's discuss it at the next board meeting. Somebody may have an agenda item they want to add. Somebody may have again, a newspaper article they want to share. Maybe a constituent brought an issue to your attention and you just want to notify your fellow board members, or you sent a response to a constituent and you want to share the response. Again, just sort of as an FYI, what you don't want is your back and forth discussion, deliberations, voting, really getting into the deep substantive work that you would do at a meeting. You don't want to do that over an email, over text messaging, anything like that. There's two problems with that. First is that if someone learned of it, they could file a complaint with us and say, look, you're in violation. You had a quorum of your board. You were together. You were talking about board business. It wasn't at a properly noticed meeting. And the other problem is sometimes people do this thinking, oh, no one's ever going to find out, right? We have these emails, we're sending them back and forth. We're talking about the big controversial project. And we have this confidence because we're all on an email chain. Well, we're going to talk about public records later, but those emails are public records. So in addition to potentially facing an FOI complaint about an illegal meeting, somebody could make a request for those emails, and then maybe they find out, what the board was talking about that they thought was private or privileged, and it may not be. So you want to be really careful about communications. Again, the key thing is with a quorum of your board. If one member wants to call the chairman or email a chairman with questions, that's okay. If a member wants to talk to town staff about an issue, that's okay. If less than a quorum, if a couple board members want to get together and discuss something, or they want to share thoughts, that's not a meeting under FOI. But once you get to a quorum, that's really the key thing that you want to avoid. Is you do not want to have a quorum of your board, no matter what the setting, discussing board business. There are a few exceptions, including caucuses, which we'll talk about in a second. But I think the rule you should be operating under is, we want to do our business in the public, right? You're on these boards to serve the town. You're discussing issues that are important to the town. You should be doing it in a way where people have the ability to, whether it's zooming in virtually or coming to the meeting where they can hear the discussion, they can better understand the decisions that are being made. So a couple of ground rules for any public meeting under FOI. Anyone can attend a meeting. Yes.
Can you go over what makes a quorum?
Sure. So basically half plus one of your board. So if you have,
Half plus one.
yeah, it needs to be more than a majority, basically enough members to vote, to carry a vote. The idea there being, if you have the voting majority of your board together, you could be making a decision that could be the decision on behalf of the whole board. If you have less than a quorum, obviously those members can't do it on their own, and they would need to bring it to the board for discussion and continued action. So yes, good question. Especially if you're new to municipal service, people may not know that term. So, it's the majority of your board, enough votes to make a decision on behalf of the board. So a couple ground rules for meetings. Anyone can attend a public meeting. They don't need to give their name. They don't need to give their address. They don't need to be from the town. You can't kick the reporters out. Everyone's allowed to come to your public meetings. As I talked about, you can set your own rules for public comment, but it's about access. You can't deny anyone access to a public meeting. Sometimes this happens in smaller towns when you have a controversial project, and there may be, let's say you were in this room today, and the fire marshal says only so many people can be in the room, and there's people outside and they want to come into the meeting. If there's an instance like that, you need to find a bigger space or move the meeting. That we've had cases where, even if it's, look, the fire marshal says we can't allow people into this room, you need to take that into consideration. So if you're on a land use board and there's a big controversial project, you may be thinking, okay, well, if we normally meet in the small conference room, is there a bigger place that we can have those meetings? Because that's an access issue. Even though, yes, legally you can't crowd the room with too many people, FOI says people have a right to attend the meeting. So you need to find, a way to do that, whether a bigger space, or, if you're able to take advantage of remote meetings and have Zoom, some people can watch from home. That may alleviate some of the crush. But not too far from here in Newtown, last year they had some action at their Board of Education where they were discussing books that people were talking about banning certain books drew a really big crowd. They had to move from their normal meeting location to the high school cafeteria because there were so many people that came out. So that's one thing to be mindful of with access to meetings is, just saying, oh, well, the room was full, is not an excuse to deny someone access to a meeting. Anyone can photograph, record, or broadcast a public meeting. They don't need to give you prior permission or anything like that. I always say I would hope that you don't say anything at a public meeting that you wouldn't want somebody to record, but just know, somebody out in the audience could be recording you, and as long as they're not being disruptive, they don't need to give you any kind of prior notice or anything like that. So now we'll talk a little bit about the different types of meetings and some of the requirements. So there's 3 kinds of meetings that are allowed under the law: regular meetings, special meetings, and emergency meetings. A regular meeting is a meeting that is on your regular meeting schedule. So by the end of January, so hopefully if you're on a board or commission, you've already done this. If you haven't, there's a way you can do it. You can come up and we can talk afterwards. But you're supposed to file with your clerk regular meeting schedule that basically says, these are the dates we're going to meet for the year. We're going to meet the second Tuesday of every month. We're going to meet first Wednesday of every month. Where you're going to meet and when, and the dates and everything. That's your regular meeting schedule. A special meeting, the name drives me crazy because I think people, especially if you're new to municipal service, you see special meeting and people think, oh my gosh, something's going on. It can only be a certain topic, or it's got to be, some extraordinary circumstance. A special meeting is just any meeting that's not on your regular meeting schedule. So it could be that there's a snowstorm and you want to move the meeting to a different date. It could be that, maybe your board meets once a month, but it's a busy time of year and you want to schedule additional meetings. Anytime you deviate from your regular meeting schedule that you filed with your town clerk, those are special meetings. That's the only thing that makes it special, is it's just outside of your regular meeting schedule. So your regular meetings, the dates and times are on that regular meeting schedule. For regular meetings, your agendas need to be filed 24 hours in advance. I do get calls from people sometimes. I understand things happen. Somebody's sick, town hall is closed, it's a holiday, you forget. They call me and they say, Russell, the meeting's tonight. We didn't have the agenda ready. We walked it in this morning. Is that okay? And I have to tell them, no, 24 hours is what the statute says. If you run into a situation where the agenda doesn't get filed on time, you run the risk of somebody filing a complaint. And one of the things that can happen with meetings that you need to be aware of, and this is, we don't do this too often. Sometimes people ask me, what are the penalties, right? What happens if we mess something up? So, like I said, we're like the state police, but we can't arrest you. So we're not going to come and haul you off in handcuffs. But for a meeting, what can happen is the commission can come in and we can nullify actions taken at meetings if there wasn't proper public notice. So, if you had a big controversial, to use planning and zoning, and you had a controversial development project, and let's say the board said, well, we're just going to not post the agenda and no one's going to know about it, right? If that happened and the commission, someone filed a complaint, the commission could come in and say, okay, you guys voted to approve that project, but the notice wasn't proper. You have to go back and do it again. You have to do your public hearing again. So if you're ever in a circumstance, I understand things happen. It may be frustrating. It may be hard because now you got to find another time when everyone can get together. But if the agenda doesn't come in within 24 hours, you really should not move forward with the meeting. So for special meetings, the agenda is also 24 hours and your notice of the meeting is 24 hours as well. So your agenda for a special meeting is also going to have your time and your place and everything, because again, it wasn't on your regular meeting schedule. For special meetings, you also need to post the agendas on the website for the town, again, because it's, additional notice because it wasn't on your regular meeting schedule. The only other thing about special meetings that's a little different is you can't add any items to the agenda at a special meeting. Quite frankly, I didn't even really know this was even possible until I started doing this job, but at a regular meeting, you can add items to the agenda that weren't on there by a 2/3 vote. So if something comes up at the meeting, maybe you have public comment and people are discussing an issue and the board wants to take action on it that evening, you can do that, or something got left off or something was late. At a regular meeting, 2/3 vote can add any item to the agenda that you want to take up that night. But if you're at a special meeting, you cannot modify the agenda. So if you're ever doing special meeting agendas, I always encourage people, put anything on there you think may come up. You can always pass on something. There's no requirement that you have to talk about everything on the agenda. But if you don't put it on the agenda and it's a special meeting, you can't vote to add it at the meeting. You can't discuss it. So anything that you think may come up at a special meeting, it's better off to put it on the agenda ahead of time.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Previously, I've been in special meetings, and we were told that the public cannot participate at a special
If you had public comment on there, they could participate. I don't know if that's the question, maybe, is if you don't have it, but there's no prohibition on public comment at a special meeting. You know, where sometimes what happens with FOI is that, and I don't know if this is the case, you may have other, you know, board rules or bylaws or things that you operate off of, and as long as those aren't in conflict with FOI, you know, there can be things that say, so a board could have a policy that says we don't have comment at special meetings. And that would be okay because FOI doesn't require public comment. So I don't know if that's the case, but under our law, we don't have any, you know, we basically say nothing about public comment. If you want to do it, you can. If you don't, you know, you don't have to. One interesting thing with that is there was a bill in the legislature last year that would have required public comment at all meetings, all public meetings of every agency. It didn't pass, but it's just something to be on the lookout for. But as of now, you wouldn't have to have comment. You could or you could not. There would be no.
So then a special, I mean, I've been to board of selectmen meetings previously, years ago. I was told at special meetings, there wasn't a public comment. So could it be that just?
That may have been their policy at the time, you know, potentially. I know sometimes. No, I know sometimes, you know, some cities and towns will do public comment at the first meeting of the month and not the second. So you're allowed to set whatever parameters you want for that. Sure. So regular meetings, special meetings. And then the third type of meeting that's allowed under the law is what's called an emergency meeting. As the name suggests, you know, really only in the event of an emergency. What's important to know about emergency meetings is this is a meeting with no notice or agenda. So, you know, there's no public notice, there's no agenda that's filed. And again, it's only to consider an emergency matter. You know, it's not an opportunity for a board to, you know, discuss an emergency and then move into discussing other topics. If you're having an emergency meeting, the only thing you want to discuss is that emergency matter. And there was a Supreme Court case involving emergency meetings, and what the Supreme Court said is it's got to be a situation that's unexpected and demands immediate action, such that it's impossible to give 24 hours notice of a meeting. Because if you think about it, with a special meeting, you only need 24-hour notice. So most things, you know, even if it's a pressing issue for your board, you could schedule a meeting in 24 hours. You know, it's about 7:30 tonight. If you were on a board or commission, you could schedule a meeting, you know, the next day. So there's a lot of flexibility there with special meetings, especially with remote meetings, which we'll talk about later. You know, there's ways you can do a meeting entirely online. So I think in this day and age, it's easier to get people together for a special meeting if you need to. But in the event, you know, it could be a weather emergency. You know, maybe there's, you know, a severe snowstorm and your board needs to get together to talk about, you know, whatever you need to do in response to that. You know, sometimes boards of education, you may need to appropriate money or move things around or hire contractors to clear snow. Certainly during COVID, we saw this early on. There was, you know, the public health orders from the state were kind of coming fast and furious, and things were changing from literally 1 hour to the next. So, you know, that was a time when we saw boards having emergency meetings because you didn't want to wait 24 hours because you didn't really know what was going to happen the next day. So if in the event you do have an emergency meeting, again, no notice or no agenda. For regular meetings and special meetings, minutes are filed within 7 days. For an emergency meeting, you only get 72 hours to do the minutes. So if you're ever in an emergency meeting, 72 hours to produce the minutes. You know, you can use this. It is a tool, but you know, you want to be careful, especially just because people are going to be a little suspicious if you say we had to have an emergency meeting for something, especially if it doesn't seem like you know, it's an emergency. You know, as I said earlier, you know, the commission can declare null and void things that happen, and that could include if you called an emergency meeting and the commission decided, you know, gee, this doesn't really seem like an emergency. You know, we talked earlier about the agendas and things coming in late. That's a call I've gotten from towns when they say, well, you know, look, the agenda wasn't in time. Can we just make this an emergency meeting? And the answer is no. You know, somebody forgetting to file the agenda is not an emergency. You know, town hall being closed on the day you were going to bring it in, it's not an emergency. You know, emergency meetings, again, it's really about, you know, you're protecting property, you're protecting, you know, people's lives could be in jeopardy or danger, some weather emergency. You know, it's those types of things where, you know, something is going to happen if you wait, and we need to take action immediately. So next thing we'll talk about, anyone have any questions on the three types of meetings? Yes.
Let me just go back because Zoom has to be notified 48.
Yeah, that's my next thing is the electronic remote meeting. So you're right on track. So any other questions on anything so far? Good. Okay. So you're right. Yes. So during COVID, again, because there was that piece in the law about electronic meetings, that was able to allow, that allowed boards and commissions to meet virtually, meet on Zoom, meet on Teams, WebEx, whatever software, people use. I'd like to say, I think we've gotten a lot better at it now, 3 or 4 years later. I think the legislature wisely recognized that there is a benefit to having, virtual meetings, especially hybrid meetings, have become pretty popular. So if people want to come in person, that's what they're used to, they can do that. But if they want to log in from home, if they want to put the kids to bed and watch the meeting, also for some of your board members, it may be beneficial. Maybe there's a time of year where, if they're working and they have a long commute, there may be meetings where it's harder for them to get there in person, but they can still participate remotely and they can bring, valuable experience. So what the legislature did was they said, look, during COVID, remote meetings were operating under an executive order. So the governor issued an executive order and said, these are the rules for remote meetings. And then the legislature looked at the executive order and they said, okay, we like some things, we don't like other things. And they kind of picked and choose. And then we ended up with this law, in the FOI Act, laying out, additional requirements for electronic meetings. And one important thing to know is sometimes people ask me, what makes it an electronic meeting? It's the way you advertise it. So if you advertise the public to attend your meeting via Zoom, that's what makes it hybrid. That's what makes it an online only meeting. You can have a member Zoom into an in-person meeting and you don't have to make it a virtual meeting for everyone. If you think about it, years ago, you would have meetings where a member may be on the speakerphone, right? Somebody's out of town, they call into the meeting. So you can still do that. You can still, call into a meeting virtually. But if you want to open it up to public attendance virtually, that's what makes it an electronic meeting under the law. And you're right. So for regular meetings, a regular board meeting with an electronic login, you need to do, the agenda is still 24 hours, but you need for 48 hours ahead of time, you need to have the link available and the instructions on how somebody can attend. So I'll say that again, if it's a regular board meeting of your board and it's either hybrid, some people online, or it's entirely remote, 48 hours ahead of the meeting, you need to post a notice on the website that has the instructions on how somebody can attend the meeting. You don't need to have the agenda 48 hours in advance. Agendas are still 24 hours. But if you wanted to, if you were able to get the agenda 48 hours ahead of time, you could just post that one document with everything, with the link and the agenda and all that 48 hours in advance. If the agenda is not ready, you need to post something else. If you have a calendar, you could post the link on a calendar. If you have a page for your board, you could post the information there. Just make sure 48 hours ahead of the meeting that information is somewhere on the website. So somebody, if they have questions, they can call. It gives people a little bit more time to figure out, how they may want to attend the meeting. What's important to know though, and it's kind of, sort of the remote meeting law is a little all over the place. You can still have a special remote meeting. So 48 hours for a regular meeting, but you can still call a special meeting remote or hybrid on 24 hours notice. So it's only your regular meetings where you need to do that 48-hour notice ahead of time. Recording meetings, that's another question we talk about now. With Zoom and everything, do we have to record our meetings? How does that all play out? So the only meetings that you have to record under the statute are entirely virtual meetings. So if you have a meeting where everyone is on the screen, everyone's on Zoom, nobody's in person in that event, and it's a regular meeting, you need to record the meeting in addition to doing the minutes. You always do the minutes. The recording is never a substitute for a minutes. Maybe your minutes are going to be shorter if you have a recording of the full meeting. But again, if it's an online only meeting and it's a regular meeting, you need to record it and post the recording on your website within 7 days, and you have to keep it up there for 45 days. If you have YouTube, it could just be a YouTube link. You don't have to necessarily have the video on the town website, just a way that somebody could access it. If it's a link to the Zoom recording, whatever it is. And then after 45 days after the meeting, you could delete those. So you don't need to keep, years and years worth of videos. If you don't have the storage space, but if you want to keep them up, if you have a place to put them on YouTube or something like that, that's fine. One thing I like to talk about with electronic meetings, we don't see as much of it anymore, but people probably remember Zoom bombing, early on during COVID. Quite frankly, I think it was just people that had too much time on their hands were kind of coming in and disrupting municipal meetings. Happened in Connecticut in a couple of places. It's a planning and zoning meeting, and then the next thing you know, the screen gets hijacked and someone's taking over and writing all kinds of crazy things or blasting music or something like that. I had a call from a state agency last week where they had this happen. Somebody came into the meeting and somehow took over the presentation and was, writing all terrible, nasty things. If anything like that ever happens, just know, an online meeting it's like an in-person meeting. You can run an orderly meeting. If someone is disruptive, if somebody, the other thing, it's not necessarily a Zoom bombing, but somebody leaves their microphone open and the radio's blaring or something and they won't shut up, or you hear the guy's arguing with his kids or something like that, and you can't conduct your business, you can mute somebody, you can kick somebody out of a remote meeting. There's also a provision in the statute that allows you to temporarily shut down an online meeting if things get really out of hand, and you can reboot it to the same link if that's necessary. I just say that because sometimes, especially in online, we get the keyboard warriors, we get people who kind of think, oh, gee, they're never going to know who I am, I can't see my face, and they tend to get a little bit bolder and they want to, cause chaos or havoc or, what have you. There was another town where they called me last week where this was happening during their public comment. Was they were getting people that were not just giving public comment, but were, really being above and beyond and belligerent and all that kind of stuff. So just know if anything like that happens, it's the same as an in-person meeting. You have a right to run an orderly meeting, and if someone's being disruptive in the virtual space, it's easier. You don't have to call the police to call them out, but you can kick them off, you can mute them, you can do whatever you need to do to run an orderly meeting. Another thing I'll talk a little bit about because it's come up. Yes.
Do you tell them ahead of time that you're going to do it, or you can just do it?
I mean, I would say give them a warning, give them an opportunity to stop. But if they're being disruptive, there's not a concern. They're not being there to observe the meeting. They're being there for the purposes of disrupting. And quite frankly, in an online situation, you probably have it recorded, right? What they're, you may have it recorded what they're doing. So if they were to challenge it, you may have a record to say, look, this is what they were doing, and they were not there just to participate. We didn't kick them out because we didn't like what they were saying. We kicked them out because they wouldn't let anyone talk, or they were talking over everybody, or they were being otherwise disruptive. So this time of year, we're getting a lot of questions about snowstorms, right, and meetings. What you don't want to do, and if you listen to what we were saying before, you realize, okay, we can't do this based on what you said about the 48 hours. If you have an in-person meeting scheduled, you cannot convert it to an online meeting the day of the meeting. I get a lot of calls about that. People will, call me in the morning. Oh, the snow, it's looking worse than we thought. The meeting's at 7 o'clock tonight. I don't know what we're going to do. Can we move the regular meeting to an online meeting? And the answer to that is no. However, there's nothing that prohibits you if you have a properly noticed hybrid meeting. So if you had it properly noticed that you were going to be in person and on Zoom, there's nothing that would prohibit you from moving forward with the Zoom portion and not having the in-person meeting. If you want to do that, though, yes.
So wouldn't that require one person to actually be in attendance? Most of the meetings are here at the municipal center, I think, here in order to get that going.
Well, it depends, I guess, on how you do it. So if you have, like, if somebody else can boot the Zoom, like if the chairman or whatever, if someone can do it from home, and you don't need a staff person. So this is kind of what we're talking about there. So if you have a way where somebody can run the Zoom on the link that you publicly noticed, that's the key thing, is you can't change the link. So it's got to be at that link that you used. But if you were able to boot up from the link that you shared, what you can do is you can cancel the in-person meeting and move forward with just the online portion. If you do that, you should post a notice on your website. And also, if you can, and this is kind of there's a piece in the statute that talks about adjourning meetings. And this is, an antiquated piece because it talks about physical notices. So what I tell people is, if you're going to do it, put a notice at the building, where the meeting was going to be, put something on the website, get the word out to people, tell everyone in town, okay, look, that meeting is not going to be in person. You don't want someone driving through the snow. I mean, I hope most people wouldn't think to drive through a blinding snowstorm to go to a meeting, but you never know. So get adequate notice to people that the in-person portion is canceled. Post something online, post something at the town hall, cover all your bases there. But because you shared that virtual link ahead of time, there still is a way people can access the meeting. But if you haven't done it as a hybrid or an online only, you can't decide on the day of the meeting because of that requirement you asked about with the 48 hours. Anyone have any questions on that?
You don't have to have the in-person part of it at all.
No, you don't have to have the in-person part at all.
We had to set up the TV so that someone could come and could watch it virtually.
As long as you have noticed it as a, if you noticed it as a hybrid, sort of my interpretation, and so when I start out, I always say this, I forgot this time, is I'm not an attorney. So this is all kind of guidance. Some things are grounded in particular decisions, others are not. This is one that this is kind of our guidance at the time. There hasn't been a complaint filed over it. There hasn't been a challenge to it. And this is the best advice that we can give. Because I know what you're talking about. There are other provisions in there about, different, things. And if somebody wants to come and they don't have the equipment and all that. So I think if something like that came up, you'd have to sort of think about what you want to do. But I think in most situations, I've run into numerous towns where they've done this and they haven't run into an issue yet. So I will say, this is, again, the guidance. Somebody could complain and say, look, I don't have a computer, now I can't come, blah, blah, blah. So it's a little bit of a newer area, but this is definitely what you don't want to do is, if it's only in person, you can't move it online. I think the other way makes sense. It's what we've been telling towns. Nobody has challenged it yet. So that's kind of our best guidance. Any other questions on electronic or remote meetings? Yes.
Just go back to the special meeting. I heard you, but if it's a special meeting and it's a hybrid, it only needs to be 24 hours?
Yes, it's one of the weird things in the law. It doesn't make sense because yes, it's 48 hours for regular, but you can still do a special. So you can still have a special meeting online with 24 hours notice with the agenda and the link. Okay, so the next thing we'll talk a little bit about is executive session. So, FOI is all about openness. It's all about, transparency. But when the legislature put the law together, they said, look, there's got to be some things that boards and commissions can do outside of public view. And in some cases for good reason, right? There could be things that are, that are confidential negotiations, or there could be lawsuits get filed and you don't want to talk about your legal strategy in public. Or it could be security issues, that need to be discussed and you don't want someone to listen in to hear, all the intricacies of the security plans. What's important to know about executive session, we'll go through the reasons in a second, but, executive session, the law is pretty narrow about what you can do in an executive session. It specifically lays out the things that you can discuss. And that's an important point, is that executive sessions are for discussion. You cannot vote in executive session. You may arrive at a consensus in executive session, based on the discussion, you probably have an idea of what people are thinking, but you still need to come out and have a public vote. You don't have to talk about what you talked about in executive session. You don't need to, rehash everything that was discussed, but you need to have a public vote. If you're going to vote to, if it's an executive session to discuss a lawsuit and the board decides, okay, we want to settle and we're going to, settle it at this dollar amount, you have to come out and you have to vote and say, okay, we're settling the Jones lawsuit for $100,000. You don't have to talk about why or what led you to that decision or what the town attorney told you or anything like that, but you need to have a public vote based on what happened in the executive session. The executive session gives you the privilege to discuss something, but the actions that you take still need to be in public. You need a 2/3 vote to go into an executive session. An executive session is part of a meeting. It could be part of a regular meeting or part of a special meeting. Even if the only thing on your agenda is an executive session, you still do an agenda, you still do minutes. The minutes don't need to reflect what you discussed in the executive session, obviously. If you did for some reason, it would be a public record and somebody would know what you talked about. So you can leave out that discussion, but you still need to do, who was there, what time you came in, what the agenda item was, and then if there were any votes that were taken. Who can attend an executive session? That's a common question that I get. You can invite in whoever you need for the executive session. So it's really up to the board or commission. But the key thing is that people need to be there for a certain reason. You're bringing in your town attorney to talk about a lawsuit. You're bringing in a department head to talk about a personnel matter, something like that. You're bringing in your police chief to talk about a security issue. Specifically what the law says is the people that are there should be there to they're giving testimony or their opinion on something, that you're asking them questions or they're giving you feedback or you're bouncing ideas off of them, that they're an active participant in the executive session. You don't want to do what's called creating a second audience. And that's when you have people that you bring into the executive session and they're just kind of sitting in the back and they're not really participating and they're just sitting there and they're listening. Because then what you're doing is you're privileging their right to attend the executive session over members of the public who may want to attend. So you can bring in whoever you want, but they should be there for a certain purpose. And then when they're not needed anymore, ask them to leave and then the board is there to discuss. The executive session is really, for the board to discuss something. They can bring in staff if they need to ask questions or review things. But ultimately the privilege of executive session is for the board to be able to make these, discuss these things outside of public view. So the 5 reasons for an executive session in the law, the first one is you can discuss a personnel matter. Personnel, sometimes people see that and they will try to interpret it to mean, budgets or police uniforms or things like that. It's meant to be about an employee. We're talking about appointing someone to a position, evaluating a public employee, the dismissal of a public employee, anything to do with someone who works for the town. It can also be for intra-board issues. You can have a personnel matter to discuss the conduct of a board member. If somebody on the board is leaving and the board wants to discuss who's going to be appointed to replace them, or it could be a discussion about the conduct of a board member. If you guys want to censure a board, anything about board members are considered to be personnel within that exemption. The important thing is that the person you're discussing, you need to notify them and tell them, hey, we're having an executive session to discuss, if it's the police chief, we're having an executive session to discuss your performance. We're having an executive session to do the evaluation of the superintendent. Whoever you're talking about, you need to notify them. And then they have the right to request that discussion happen in an open session. They don't necessarily get the right to attend the executive session. Most times you'll probably invite them in because you want to hear from the person who's at the center of whatever this personnel issue is. But their right under FOI is to say, no, I want this to be held out in the open. Sometimes, people may get accused of things, or they may feel that a board is, going to give them a bad evaluation or something. And they may say, look, let's have it at a public meeting. So then my friends can sit in the audience, my family, my coworkers, whoever I want can be there. And they're all going to hear what you're saying about me, because I think that you guys don't know what you're talking about. So if that ever happens, if someone says, I want that discussion to be in the open session, you have to do it in an open session. You don't have a choice. Their right under FOI is that if they're being talked about, they can request that be done in the public. The second reason for an executive session is to discuss pending claims or litigation. The important thing with that is that that word pending, so it really needs to be a lawsuit has been filed, a demand letter has been sent. Somebody sends you something, we're going to sue you if you don't do this. It could also be the board considering taking some kind of legal action. Maybe you're talking about suing a state entity or appealing some kind of decision. It could be the board is the one that is going to take the legal action. Again, something imminent. It can't be. Sometimes people see that and they think, oh, it's meant to be, or they try to extend it to be things that are controversial, or oh, this is a thorny issue, or this could we could get sued maybe. So that's not what that exemption is for. There isn't, we'll talk a little bit later about attorney-client privilege. So there are some ways that you can get legal advice, from a town attorney in an executive session. But under pending claims or litigation, it's meant to talk about a particular case or a particular matter that's ongoing. You can have an executive session to discuss security issues if you feel that a public discussion would undermine the issue that you're talking about. We didn't see this too often for a while, but then after Sandy Hook, we started to see it more and more with boards of education going into executive sessions for security matters. You're talking about where you're going to put cameras in the school or what security upgrades you're going to want to, install. It makes a lot of sense that you wouldn't want to have that discussion in public so that somebody can't go onto YouTube and watch the meeting and learn about the intricacies of your security system. Again, with all of these, the votes are always going to be in public. So if you're going to appropriate money for your security system, that needs to be a public vote. But the discussion about what it entails or what is this, your security consultant recommends, things like that could be discussions you do in an executive session. You can have an executive session to discuss the sale or lease of property if you feel that a public discussion would impact the price. An example of this, maybe you're looking for a piece of land for new athletic fields, and the town may be willing to spend, up to $500,000. You find a parcel that's listed for half that. You may not want to come out publicly and say, oh, our budget is $500,000, because then the property owner is going to say, okay, I want $500,000 for the land that was listed for half that. So, if you, like security, if you feel the security issue would be compromised here, if you feel the negotiations of the price would be compromised, you can discuss the sale or lease in executive session. But once you want to sign it or vote to buy the property, those are the public votes. And then the last reason for an executive session is the broadest, and this says that you can discuss any records that are exempt from FOI in an executive session. So we'll go over some of the exemptions more in detail, but a couple that come up pretty frequently, I mentioned earlier, attorney-client privilege. So if you're on a board and you need to get the legal opinion from your town attorney, about an action that you want to take, or something that you received, or a concern about an issue, what you should do is contact your town attorney, ask them to give you some sort of legal memo or something that they would send to you, and then the board can go in executive session to review that document with the town attorney and talk to the town attorney and ask questions and discuss it and all that. You really shouldn't be having an executive session for kind of free-ranging legal advice. It needs to kind of be grounded in a particular document. So the best way to do it there would be, again, attorney-client privilege protects that document from disclosure. If somebody FOI'd a copy of your legal memo, you don't have to give it out. So you can go into executive session and you can review that, discuss it, ask questions. Another one that comes up is there's an exemption in the law. It's not unlimited, but for a period of time for bids. In the time between the bids come back and when you award a contract, you don't have to disclose those records under Freedom of Information. And this is a little bit of it's not new, but I think it's within the last 10 years or so that this changed. Because when I was a reporter, when I started, a lot of towns, some still do, they would do the bid opening, right? They would have the public bid opening, all the contractors would come, they sit around the table, they open them up, this is what this person put, this is what this person put. But what was happening was, there'd be a bid deadline, people would submit bids, and then other contractors would FOI the bids before the deadline and get copies of what the other people's proposals were, and then they would modify their proposal and submit it, 5 minutes before the deadline, because so they knew that they had the best deal. So this exemption got put in. Again, it's limited. So once you sign a contract, you need to disclose the bids. But before that point, if a board wants to review them, discuss them in an executive session, you could do that. Any questions on executive sessions? Yes.
So if you're discussing disciplinary action with a employee, does he have a right to be in executive session?
So his right is that he can have that in an open session. You don't have to bring him into the executive session.
So he doesn't have the right.
No, they don't have a right to attend the executive
So
session.
he doesn't request an open.
No, if they don't, your obligation is to notify them, and then they can request an open session. If you don't want to bring in the employee, you don't need to. I mean, most of the time they probably will be for part of it, but that's an important thing to know is too, you could bring in the employee, ask them questions, and then ask them to leave while you guys have your deliberation about what to do. They don't get to be there for the whole time. Their right is to have it. If they want to know what happens, then they have to have it out as an open session. They don't get to decide they want to go into the executive session and then say, oh, I want to stay for the whole time. It's up to you. If you want them in there to ask questions, you could do that. But then you could tell them, okay, we've asked the questions. We want, now you have to leave. We're going to talk about what we want to do.
All right.
Yeah.
So the voting has to happen outside of the executive session.
Mhm.
So the votes come out. How detailed do you have to be in the voting? So let's say it's a security issue and you're going to put in 5 cameras for $20,000, right? And it's going to go this, and this place. Can you make a motion that says we will accept the discussed security plan that came to us from company XYZ, and that's what gets voted on? Or do you have to say it's going to be for the 5 cameras, $20,000?
So I would think that, the key thing is kind of like the executive session. You don't have to say so much that you're going to compromise whatever the issue is. So I think in that case, I would say, you could say something like, we're going to vote to spend $20,000 to approve the security plan as discussed in executive session. Something like that. Again, I'm glad you brought that up, because I missed one thing I try to always hit on here is agendas for executive session. This is a common thing where people get tripped up. If you're having an executive session, you put it on the agenda item for the executive session. You don't just want to list the category that we talked about. So you don't want to just say executive session personnel, executive session security, executive session pending claims or litigation. We've had cases where the commission and the courts have backed this up, have said, you need a little bit more detail than that. The public has a right to know the topic being talked about in an executive session. They don't get to be in the executive session. They don't get to hear the discussion. But, in your example, if it's a security system for, this building, an appropriate agenda item might be, executive session to discuss, the security plans for the municipal building. You don't have to talk about that it's cameras or bulletproof glass or, what have you, but it's got to be a little bit more than just security issue. If it's a personnel matter, you don't need to necessarily identify the employee in question, but you should say something like, personnel matter, discussion of the performance of a town hall employee, personnel matter, discussion of the performance of a police officer. For pending claims or litigation, if you're talking about a lawsuit that's been filed, it's public that the lawsuit's been filed, you could put something like executive session, discussion of the Smith lawsuit. You don't need to say that you're talking about a settlement or what you're talking about or what the board thinks, but people know that you're discussing that lawsuit or you're discussing, a personnel issue in this department or something like that. Yes.
Do you have to come to an action?
In executive session?
Like, you're discussing discipline for a personnel issue, and you, I don't decide what to do. How many, months in a row can you go through the same?
I mean, what you want to avoid, and there's a case where this happened, is you want to avoid kind of having a situation where you don't want the board to kind of come to a consensus. And let's say it's a school matter and your superintendent's in the executive session, you're discussing this personnel issue, and you don't take a vote, but you kind of leave the executive session with the understanding that something is going to take, that's what you want to avoid. You could have executive sessions for subsequent months about a topic and never make a decision. There's no prohibition on that. But what you don't want is you don't want to go into an executive session and then, if your board of education is supposed to vote to fire a teacher, you want to have the vote, you don't want to just have the executive session with the superintendent and then everyone leaves with the understanding what's going to happen, but there's not an action taken,
It's doing nothing.
I think it would depend on this. I would think no, but it might depend on what the circumstances are. If it's something where the board needs to weigh in some way and they're saying, well, we're just gonna, by doing nothing, we're saying no, but it's something where they need to vote no, they would need to vote no, I would think. So if you want to ask, we can talk afterwards if there's a specific thing, but yes.
So if you're having an executive session just to discuss security plan, there is no vote, then
There wouldn't be a vote. You would just have executive session, discussion of security plan, and that would be it.
you don't need to.
No, unless there's something that requires a vote. If it's, if there's an action, if the board is appropriating money, if they're gonna, terminate a person or they're gonna enter into a settlement or, they're gonna do something. But there can be plenty of executive sessions where, there's a discussion and nothing happens, and it could happen at a subsequent meeting, or the board could decide, we don't want to take action at this time on this, right? Think of a lawsuit, for example. There could be many executive sessions to discuss a lawsuit. The town attorney may come in and give you updates about where things stand. We were in court, we did this, we did that. I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about that. And it might not require the board's action, unless, maybe like a settlement, for example, that might be something where the board needs to make a decision. But there could be times throughout where there's updates that are happening and it's not going to be an action taken. Quickly, we'll run through, this is another part, as if FOI wasn't confusing enough. We talked all about what are meetings and quorums and all this. There's also exceptions to everything that I basically just talked about. If you look at the definition of a meeting, it defines it, and then it says, but these things are not meetings. And the number one thing is caucuses. That comes up all the time. So you can have if you have a board and one party has the majority, and that's a quorum, right? The Republicans have a quorum on, the Board of Finance, or Republicans have a quorum on the Board of Education. If they're all of the same party, they can caucus together, even if they're talking about board business, and it's not a meeting under FOI. So that's one of the bigger loopholes in the law. But you can have a caucus. The key thing is your caucus is limited to your members of your same board and your same party. A caucus is not an invitation to bring in other boards, to bring in your town chairman, to start bringing in all kinds of town staff. The caucus is really supposed to be limited to the members of the same board and the same party. You're not limited in what you can discuss. It doesn't need to only be, the challenge with this is, the caucus exemption, the legislature put that in there for themselves. And things up in Hartford are more political than a lot of the issues that you're dealing with. There's not necessarily going to be, a Republican position on, this topic, or a Democratic position on, this topic. But because of the way the law is written, you can have those caucuses and you can talk about anything that you want to talk about that's before your board. Again, same board, same party. So that's the first one. Anything to do with collective bargaining. So if there are any boards that get updates, if you're on a board of education, superintendent wants to give you an update on where things stand with the contract negotiations, Those can be done outside of meetings. That's another carve out from the meetings provision. Any board or commission can create a personnel search committee for an executive level employee. So this could be, again, your Board of Education. They could appoint a search committee. And I talked earlier about, subcommittees and following FOI, but this is the one exception. So you can create a search committee to look for your superintendent, to look for your police chief, your fire chief, whatever it may be. And that search committee, when they're operating as a search committee, doesn't need to notice meetings. They don't need to do agendas. They can do all their work independently. The idea being eventually they're going to have to bring it back to the board for a vote. They're going to have to vote to approve the person that they recommended to be the new fire chief, the police chief, or the superintendent. And then the other thing that is not a meeting under FOI, even though it's a quorum, is what's called the chance or a social meeting. And this is where your board is together, but you're in a situation where you're not talking about board business. So this could be, you're at a community event, you're, out to dinner, anything like that. And again, the important thing is you want to not be talking about board business in those settings. It's inevitable. Things are going to come up. You may be friendly outside of your board, but you probably spend a lot of time together talking about those sort of things. So you want to try to steer the conversation, in a different direction. You want to talk about weather, sports, whatever it may be, your kids, something that's not related to your board. Because what you really want to avoid is what I call the parking lot meeting, which is where you have your meeting, and then after the meeting, the board is all standing around the parking lot and they're talking about the meeting. If you're blowing off steam, that's okay. Oh my God, I can't believe this guy had public comment. He was going on and on and on. Whatever, those types of things are not as much of an issue, but what you don't want to do is you don't want to continue the discussion from the meeting. If you're on planning and zoning, and you're talking about a site plan and the meeting gets continued and there's no decision that's been made, you don't want to be standing out there and continuing to talk about what you think about the proposal or trying to convince your board members one way or the other. If the developer walks out and he sees you guys and he hears you talking, he could file a complaint and say, look, they were discussing my application out in the parking lot. I didn't get to hear what they were thinking. For all I know, they're talking about how they're going to torpedo it at the next meeting. So, you can be friendly with people on your boards and commissions. You can get together outside of board meetings, but you don't want to be continuing the discussion that you were having at the board meeting. Yes.
Does that mean that after a vote has been held on any particular item, that then it's okay if you have?
So there's not anything, I would still say to try,
I agree.
yeah, steer clear of it, because it doesn't differentiate about the vote or not. It just says that, if you're discussing board business. So, even if that matter's been, you don't know if it's been concluded, maybe, but who knows? There could be an appeal. The person could come along again with another project or something like that. So you want to be careful with that. We already talked about, email and meetings. You want to be careful because a quorum on an email could be constituted as a meeting. I like to say, if you're in the corporate world, everyone always says, gee, this meeting could have been an email. In FOI world, it's, gee, this email could have been a meeting. So just be careful, with email. Obviously you can't vote over email, can't make decisions over email. You want to do that work in your public meetings. The last thing we'll talk about with meetings is minutes. With minutes, brevity goes a long way. The law only requires for minutes a recording of who was at the meeting, any votes that you took, and then if you have an executive session, you list who attended the executive session other than any job applicants. But other than that, the content of the minutes is entirely up to you. Yes. Sure. You could have a caucus over email, but what you want to be aware of is there's no record exemption for those records. So if you are caucusing over email, you're not in violation of the meetings provision of the law. But if you're the Republican team and the Democrats FOI your emails, they're public records and they could be disclosed. So there's no privilege to the documents you create if it's an electronic caucus. And the same thing goes with executive session. The executive session privilege allows you to discuss those issues. But if you go back and you send an email about what you talked about in executive session, that's a public record. There's not a exemption for executive session as a record. So, don't take really diligent notes in an executive session and go home and type it up and send it to everybody, because then it's public record and somebody could request it. We'll talk about the exemptions later, but I would say at the municipal level, if it's emails about your board business, it's probably not going to fall into one of the exemptions. There, we'll go through them, but most of the time it would be, unless it's like a legal issue or a legal opinion, those would need to be disclosed.
Does the caucus have to be noticed?
You don't have to notice a caucus, no. Because it's not a meeting under FOI. It's not considered to be a public meeting. Again, same board and same party. Yes.
What about the time for the minutes going in and out of
You mean like in terms of putting the time? Yeah, so if you have an executive session, yes, put the time that you go in, the time that you go out. And the minutes need to be available within 7 days after a meeting. Even if the board hasn't met again, you could call them draft, you could call them unapproved, whatever you want to do. Don't wait for the board to vote on them to send them to the clerk. The minutes need to be available within 7 days. And they're still required, even if you have a recording of a virtual meeting, you still need to do minutes. But as I said, you can be as brief as you want or as detailed as you want. But if your 15-page minutes come in 2 weeks late, that's a violation. That's what you want to avoid. You don't have to list the people that speak in public comment in the minutes. Nobody has a right to attach documents to the minutes if they come up after the meeting and they try to hand you something and put this in the minutes, none of that. You're in charge. Whoever does the minutes is in charge of the detail, the level of detail that you want to put in there. So don't, feel like you got to go on and on and on and do these big magnum opuses and list every single person that speaks or anything like that, or try to get every, back and forth detail. You want to capture the spirit of the discussion, but it doesn't need to be, and it's not meant to be, a transcript of the meeting.
So I have a question. So
Yes.
related to the public comment component, there's no need to document people who speak, but the individual municipalities do require that.
If there's a,
Especially though there's Zoom going on.
well, so it's up to, it's up to the board. So if you want to require people to give their name for public comment, you could do that. And if you want to record it in the minutes, you could, but you don't have to. So you can, as I said earlier, with public comment, you set the rule. So if the rule is give us your name and address, then people have to give their name and address. But you can't, you couldn't give name and address to come and sit at the meeting. If people want to sit and just observe, they can do that. The challenge with the minutes and the public comment is if people are used to it, they will complain if they're not in there. But there's nothing we would do about it. It's up to you how you want to handle that. So, because I had one town, they had a meeting where it was like really long public comment, and they were like, well, usually we list everybody. And what I had suggested, I think what they did was I said, look, if you recorded the meeting, you could always put a link to the public comment. So if somebody wants to go and watch it, watch it all and see what everyone said, they could do that. And then you're not having to try to type up, 50 people's names and addresses and all that in the minutes. So the minutes, the main thing is, you're in control. The only thing we care about is that they get in on time. So, so that was meetings. Anyone have any questions about meetings before we move on to records? No? Okay. The important thing with, oh, sorry.
So if you have two different boards, you have two different types of minutes made.
Yeah, it's up to however the board wants to run it. One board wants to get really detailed and list everything that happened. That's fine. I feel bad for that poor recording secretary, but the boards are in charge, and there doesn't need to be a uniform policy or anything like that. If the town wanted to try to institute something, they could, but really it's up to each each board how they want to do it. Yes, that's their, again, if the first selectman comes in and says, hey guys, your minutes are 2 lines long, I think you need to do more, that could be something, but it's, it's up to the board. And the only thing, again, the main thing we care about are the things we listed, the votes and all that, and that they get in on time. That's what would be the FOI issue. Yes.
Just one quick thing. So regarding this issue of public comment, can you, at the beginning of a meeting, can you limit the amount of time that someone
Yep.
speaks?
Yeah, you can.
Does that have to be part of the bylaws, or would that be something you dictate at the beginning of the meeting?
You could decide that on the day of the meeting if you wanted to. So you could come to a meeting and you could look out the door and you could see all kinds of people, and you could say, okay, tonight we're doing 2 minutes per person because we got stuff to get through. And that's not an FOI violation. You're allowed to set the rules for public comment, even if they change meeting to meeting.
Okay, should that be noted in your minutes?
You wouldn't have to, it's up to you if you wanted to, if you knew ahead of time, maybe put it on the agenda just so people know what to expect. If okay, this meeting, we're going to, we know it's a big topic, so we're going to limit it for this purpose, or we're going to limit it to items on the agenda or something like that. You could do that. And if you know ahead of time, maybe put it on the agenda, but you don't have to in any event.
Thank you.
Question.
Yes.
I want to make sure I understood correctly. You could open the Zoom link to commission members only, but not public, and it's just an in-person meeting?
So the way to think of it is you can't have nobody in the meeting. You need to have, the way that it works, the way the law is written is that, you know, you can have you know, you would need to have somebody, there needs to be a member present, there needs to be somebody there to run the meeting. But if you had a meeting, let's say you had 5 members on a board and you had 2 that were in person and 3 that were on the Zoom, you could still have a hybrid meeting like that. There's not a, you know, you can't have nobody there. You know, you need to have someone there to be in the, you know, be physically there in person. But the thing that makes it an electronic meeting is how you sort of advertise it. So if you, you know, just because board members are participating remotely, doesn't necessarily mean you have to open it up to the, you know, to the public. The challenge I think you would run into is that if the whole board is, or the majority of the board is not physically there, people are probably not going to be happy. But under FOI, it's sort of like I said, it's like the old example of people calling in on the speakerphone. You know,
That's okay. If you advertise it as an in-person meeting, you have one commission member that's out of town using a Zoom in.
yeah, that's fine.
That's
Yeah.
fine.
Yeah, that's the
You're
same.
not opening Zoom to.
No, again, that's the, I would think of it the same way of, you know, again, you know, before we ever had Zoom, somebody's calling in on the speakerphone and they're, you know, we have, like our commissioners at our meetings, we have, you know, sometimes people will, you know, call in, we open up the dial-in line to, but you don't need to. It's as long as you notice it properly as an in-person meeting, and just because a member calls in doesn't mean that you have to open it up to everybody. Okay, so now we'll talk about records. You know, the important thing with records to know is that, you know, the definition of a public record in Connecticut is really very broad. If you're new to public service, you know, you may be surprised by it. I'll just read a piece of it. So a public record in Connecticut, it's any recorded data or information relating to the conduct of the public's business, prepared, owned, used, received, or retained by a public agency, or to which a public agency is entitled to receive a copy by law or contract. Whether such data or information be handwritten, typed, tape recorded, videotaped, printed, photostated, photographed, or recorded by any other method. And except as otherwise provided by any federal law or state statute, all records maintained or kept on file by any public agency, whether or not such records are required by any law or by any rule or regulation, shall be public records. So again, it's really all encompassing. The key thing is if it relates to town business, if it relates to board business. The device you use, that's a common question we get. The device you use doesn't matter. If it's a personal cell phone, but it's a text message about your board business, it's a public record. If it's your, you know, your work email for your job, you know, at Sikorsky, but you're sending emails about, you know, Bethel planning and zoning, those are public records. The important thing to know is, you know, it's not like me or a requester is going to get to go through all your devices and look for the records. But if you get a records request, you would have to go through those personal devices or those personal emails and pull out anything that's relative to your town business. So if you have the ability to use a town email, I would strongly suggest you do, because just everything's all in one place. Or if you use a Gmail account or something like that, you know, make sure that you sort of segregate the things that you know are related to planning and zoning and things like that. You know, we don't deal with records retention, so we're not going to get into, you know, how long you have to keep certain records, but there are records retention laws that are enforced by the Connecticut State Library. So that's the challenge if you use a personal account, is that there could be certain things that you're supposed to keep for a certain amount of time. And maybe your policy is, I clear out my inbox, you know, every month, I delete everything, but maybe there's information in there about a project or something that, you know, some statute says you're supposed to keep for a certain amount of time. So again, if you can use a town email, I think that's always better. But if you don't, just know that, you know, the records you create related to town business are public records. And the law has 2 ways people can get copies of, or can get access to public records. They can ask to inspect public records, or they can ask for copies of public records. So public records inspections, you know, really doesn't happen at the board and commission level. It's just more, you know, in town hall. But just know that, you know, somebody can come into a public building. You can come to town hall as a board or commission member, and you can ask to, you know, let me see the file for that property in the building department. I want to see a copy of the police blotter and see who was arrested last week. So you can come in, you can physically inspect records. But more frequently, you know, you're going to get a request for copies of records, an FOI request, you know, is what we would call it. A couple important things to know about FOI requests. People don't need to use a specific form. Basically any written correspondence you get requesting a record, even if somebody emails you and says, I want a copy of the agenda, I want a copy of the minutes, I want a copy of that report, anything in writing where someone requests a public record under Connecticut, that's an FOI request. They don't need to cite the act or say a statute or anything like that. If you get a request for public records, it's an FOI request. Number one important thing to do if you ever get an FOI request, the law requires you to acknowledge the FOI request within 4 business days. Again, we talked about in the beginning of the laws from 1975. The reason that was put in there is because back in 1975, people were sending the request by mail. So basically they put it in there so you would get a letter back saying, okay, we got your request, because otherwise how would you know? So in this day and age, it's mostly over email. So, you can get back to the person that much quicker. But if you don't respond within 4 business days, the law considers that you've denied that request. So even if you started to process the things, or you were working on it or talking to the first selectman about it, if you never tell the person, hey, we got it, we're going to look into it, they have no way of knowing, so they can file a complaint and say, look, they never responded to my request. Now, holidays, you're out of town, it's really 4 days of when you look at it. If somebody sends you an FOI request at midnight on Thursday before a holiday weekend or something like that, we're not going to say, oh, you get back to them on Tuesday and you're too late. It's 4 days of when you receive it. So, but if you get an FOI request, if you're not the person to respond, if you're on a border commission and the chairman is the one that wants to respond, or whatever it may be, or the town attorney, or however you want to do it, just make sure somebody gets back to the requester within 4 business days. Because if you don't, they could file a complaint, and there are people out there who will file a complaint on the 5th day if they don't hear back from you, just because they know they can't.
Russell?
Yes.
Russell, excuse me. We just have some questions in the chat. Is now a good time for me to share those?
Let me open up the chat.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, Nicholas, are we required to document and state for the record people's names? So we talked about that. You don't need to document the names of people for public comment. You could require them to give their names if you wanted to. And it would be legal for you to ask names and addresses. So if you want to ask names and addresses for public comment, that's fine. If you want to put them in the minutes, that's fine. Neither one is required. You set your own rules for public comment. So if you want public comment, you want people to identify themselves, that's fine. If you want to put them in the minutes, you can do that. You're not required to put them in the minutes, and nobody, the rules for public comment, again, you can set those. Okay, so records requests, acknowledge it within 4 business days. And then the goal of, the other question I get a lot of times, how long do we have to respond to an FOI request, right? This used to kind of drive me crazy, because what the law says, it just says that you need to provide public records promptly upon request, which is wide open for interpretation, right? I mean, and that's why we get so many complaints a lot of times, is because, people who want the records want them immediately, right? They think 2 days is too long. And then the agencies are calling me and they're like, how long do we have to respond to this? And all I can tell them is, well, promptly, which doesn't offer much help. But there are some parameters that the commission came up with in an advisory opinion some years ago. And basically the way to think of it is, these are the factors we consider about whether or not you're being prompt, about whether or not you're fulfilling your obligations under freedom of information. And the things that we look at when we look at an FOI request, and if an agency is being prompt, include the volume of records requested. So how big is the request? If it's a big request, we understand it's going to take longer. The amount of personnel time necessary to complete the request. Maybe it's very complicated. Maybe you need to go to your attorney for redactions or what have you, or it requires you to gather documents from different places around your office or something. You got to go in the basement and pull archive, whatever it may be. That's a factor too. Time constraints that the agency is under. If you're on on the Board of Finance and you're working on the budget, and it's that time of year where you're having a lot of meetings and it's your busiest time of the year, it may take you longer to comply with FOI requests at that point. The key way to think of it is, it's really a balancing act, and it's not easy. I do the FOI requests we get at the commission. Believe it or not, we get maybe 25 or 30 a year, because people are unhappy with our decisions and they're starting to ask for our emails and other decisions that we made. And I had to do one recently where I had to go into the basement and pull some old files and things like that. So I understand, the challenge that it can present, because I'm trying to do everything else that I need to do. And there's only so many hours in the day. But what we like to see is really, it's sort of, an effort to comply with the request. What we don't want is you to, get the acknowledgement letter out. Okay, they emailed me, I emailed them back within the 4 business days. And now I'm just going to push this to the side of my desk, and I'm not going to worry about it until I get a letter that a complaint's been filed, or they call me 2 months later and they ask me how it's going, and I go, oh yeah, I'm working on that. We'll have it to you soon. If it's a really big request, you can always try to ask the requester to narrow their request. If they want 5 years worth of information, you could say, hey, I could do the last year, and it would be much quicker. If you're on a board or commission and they're asking for all the information about a certain topic, you could go back to them and say, hey, is there something you're really interested in about this? Is there a particular, thing about this that you want to know more about? Maybe they want to know what the price tag for a project, and that's really what they're concerned about. And then you could say, okay, well, you don't need every email from every commissioner. I can give you the budget documents about the project, and that's only 50 pages of records instead of 5,000 emails that I have to track down from everybody in town. So you can always try to work with the person. I always say, you don't need to view an FOI request as an adversarial thing necessarily. I know sometimes we do. We think, oh my gosh, who is this person? Why do they want the records? What are they going to do with the information? But really, you have to look at the request and kind of put your blinders on. I know that there's nobody in the town of Bethel that ever gives anyone a hard time. You don't have people that come to your meetings and complain during public comment or ask for all kinds of records and ask all kinds of questions. But even if it's that person and they make an FOI request, look at what they're asking for. And, we'll talk about the exemptions in a second, but look at the request. What are the records? Do you have them? Do you not have them? Are there any exemptions? That's the way you need to handle it. You need to kind of you can't worry about what the person's going to do with it. The law doesn't distinguish, requesters from one another. If it's a public record for me, it's a public record for you. It's a public record for you. The people are entitled to these records. It doesn't matter what their motives may be or what they want to do with it. If they want to put it on their website, they want to use it for political purposes, they want to use it for commercial purposes. There's no distinction made in the law. If it's a public record, it needs to be made available promptly.
Anything that's considered an unreasonable request?
In terms of like the scope of a request?
Yeah.
So not under the law. I mean, other than, if somebody makes a request for 50 years of records, you could say, okay, it's going to take me 10 years to do, so there's practical limitations, but that is one of the challenges. Is there's not a statutory limitation on how much people can ask for. That's one reason why I talked about records retention. If you look it up on the Connecticut State Library, you can destroy public records after a certain period of time. It's a good idea to do that so you don't find yourself in that situation, that you're digging through all kinds of boxes under your desk and try to find things that, because somebody made an FOI request for it, but there is no limitation on it. Other than, practically, if you tell the person, look, it's going to be years for you to get everything, you would hope that most people are going to say, okay, I'll try to narrow my request.
The other part of my question is, you don't have to, staff or commissioner or whatever, you don't have to create any.
Yes, yeah. So exactly. So you don't have to create records that don't already exist. You don't have to do research. You don't have to answer questions. It's about FOIs providing records that you have as you maintain them, as you keep them. You're not doing formatting. You're not doing analysis. If this is the PDF that you have, that's what you give the person. A little bit about fees. There's no fees for electronic records. So if somebody wants emails, they want PDFs, anything like that, there's no cost for that. You can't charge for the time it takes you to search for the records to provide them. You can charge for paper copies. If you have any records that are paper, you can charge 50 cents a page for paper records. The one charge you can do for digital is if you have to buy a flash drive or something like that to put the records on, you could charge the person the cost of the flash drive, but digital, no charge. Paper is 50 cents a page. So yes, you're not required to scan anything in. So if it already exists digitally, you have to provide it, but you don't have to scan paper records in to email to somebody. Yes.
If reports are given to a board on a monthly basis, and the board makes a motion to approve them, that becomes public record?
Yeah, any.
Where are they stored? You said public record, where do they go?
I guess it would depend on where where your board. There's no limitation on where you could put a public record. If your chairman keeps the reports in his house, I mean, maybe not the best file keeping system, but those are public records. So wherever they exist, if they're relating to board business, they're public records that somebody could request.
So they can be in somebody's basement?
They could be in somebody's basement. I've been out to some of these like smaller taxing districts or lake authorities or things like that, and they literally do keep the records in a basement. Also in some of those cases, they have their public meetings at someone's house. Like you could have a planning and zoning commission meeting at your house, but you would have to let the public come in. So which you probably wouldn't want to do. But if the records are wherever they are, you want to know where they are. But in this day and age, a lot of them are probably exist electronically. It may be in your email is where the record is, that report, right? You have to go retrieve it from your email.
So the only thing that officially has to be recorded is minutes and files?
Under FOI, yeah, just the minutes. So you don't have to record the attachments or anything like that. You don't have to attach the documents to the minutes if you don't want to. If you want to, great, you can, but you're not required to.
So those monthly records are sent by email to board members to look at before the meeting. So they're all in our email.
Mhm.
So our emails can be FOI.
Yeah, if it pertains to town business, somebody could request a copy of any.
How long do we have to keep them in our emails?
So I don't, this is the part where I get to say that's not us. It's the Connecticut State Library. And the way that it works is depends on the content of the email. So in that example, it may be that there's a provision in there about things that are copies. So if that is, you're getting a copy of something and it's not the original, then you don't need to keep it. But if it's the original, you know, then, so that's where it gets a little, the digital thing, it gets a little difficult. But, you know, I would say, look, if it's a report that has been, you know, that the town has, that was just sent out to you, then you don't necessarily need to keep those, because there is a, you know, it's a copy of a record that exists. But if it's a, you know, if it's an email between you and the town planner talking about something related to a particular project, you know, those may be things that are things you would keep. So it depends on the content of the email. But if you go on their website, they have a whole thing where you can put in what the record is, and it explains how long to keep it and all that.
So my second question is, if you are taking the minutes of a meeting and you're taking it on your personal device, how long does that have to stay in?
Well, you're going to produce the minutes in some document, right?
Right.
Yeah. So I would argue if it's just that because this comes up sometimes where people ask about like recording the meeting.
Right.
If the only purpose of you recording the meeting is for the purposes of doing the minutes, or if you're taking, you know, if you're writing things on your phone as a note and then you're producing the minutes, we'll talk about the exemptions in a second. There's an exemption for what's called personal notes. So I would think that if you have the minutes and all you're writing, you know, you're writing them down as you go on a piece of paper, but they get translated into the real minutes, I don't think you need to keep the scrap of paper. You have the minutes or the record of the meeting. You could get rid of the scrap of paper where you were writing things down.
Okay. What if you're doing the notes on a computer? You can get rid of that too?
Yeah, if it's just for
if
it's just for the purposes of producing the minutes,
Right.
then I don't think you need to keep the preliminary, you know, the note thing. We'll talk about that in a second about notes. So again, you know, that's a little bit about FOI requests. They can't, you know, don't need to use a specific form. You want to be prompt in producing the records. And then the way FOI is structured in Connecticut is, you know, this was in the definition that I read earlier. Everything's a public record except if there's another law or state statute. So if there's another law on the books anywhere that says don't give some information out, or that certain records are privileged, that'll always supersede FOI, whether it's at the state or the federal level. The challenge is there's a lot of state laws. We don't have time to go through all of them that exempt certain records. Some of them are surprising. The example I always like to share, and I don't do it to beat up on teachers. My wife is a teacher. We love teachers. But there's an exemption in the law that says if you're a public school teacher, your employee evaluation is not disclosable under FOI. So if you're a police officer, you're a firefighter, somebody can request your evaluation. If you're a public school teacher, they can't, because there's a law that says so. So there are these laws throughout the statutes dealing with certain records. I mean, some of them are, you know, some of them are ones you could probably think of, you know, DCF, for example. There's a law about Department of Children and Families that exempt a bunch of their records. There's laws about, you know, juvenile court proceedings that make some of those records privileged. So those are what we call the exceptions. But the exemptions are what's in our law. And I have some handouts here you can grab at the end, and the little booklet there, you know, it lists a bunch of them, but I'm just going to quickly, you know, go through some of the common exemptions. So these are basically allowances in FOI, kind of like an executive session, where these are records that you don't need to release. So to your point, there's an exemption for preliminary drafts or notes. So if you're taking personal notes during a meeting as a memory aid during an executive session, you're jotting things down so you remember what happened. Those would be exempt from FOI. Preliminary drafts is usually, you know, let's say you task the staff with doing some kind of report for the board until they submit it to the board for action. If there's back and forth, you know, where things are being added, subtracted, that kind of thing, it's a working document. Once it's ready for you to make a decision, once it goes to the board, it goes in that monthly email. Here's what we're taking up. Once the board is ready to do something with it, it's a public record that you would need to disclose. Personnel files, this is another one that comes up pretty frequently. The key thing with records in a personnel file is that you don't need to release anything that would pose an invasion of personal privacy. And again, it's one of those things kind of like promptness, you know, where it's this vague. standard, right? What does that mean? Some people are very private, keep to themselves. Other people are on Facebook blabbing about every little thing that happened in their entire day. But what the courts have said is that to invade the privacy of a public employee, it needs to be a release of information that would be highly offensive to a reasonable person if it were to be released, and it needs to not pertain to a matter of public concern. And that second part is the part that's a really high bar to clear. If you think about it, there could be things in our personnel files that we may not want released. We may not want people to know how much money we make. We may not want people to know that we got a bad performance review. We may not want people to know that, we got caught on Facebook at work and we got suspended for a day or whatever it is. But there's great public interest in the work of our public employees. I work for the state, you are on boards and commissions, or you work for the town, we're doing the public's business. So, there's a great interest in knowing if we're doing a good job or not, quite frankly. So sometimes people come from the private sector, they're a little surprised by that, the openness of personnel records. But really the only information from personnel records that would not be disclosed are, medical issues. Maybe somebody, seeks counseling through a town program or something like that for a mental health issue. It's pretty limited. Again, it's got to be information that would, be offensive if it were released and not pertain to a matter of public concern. It's not just embarrassing information. It's not just things we don't want out there. There needs to be something that we don't, would be offensive, and there's not, a public interest in disclosing that. So a couple other exemptions. We talked about security in an executive session. There's also an exemption for security records. So potentially, security plans or schematics or things like that would be things you wouldn't need to release. Attorney-client privilege, we talked about that already. Records protected by attorney-client privilege. Communications between the town attorney seeking legal advice, those don't need to be released. Another one that comes up sometimes in town halls is trade secrets. This is typically where the town is engaging with an outside firm maybe you're a vendor with them and they're sharing proprietary pricing information or proprietary information about their product. In your security example, maybe they're sharing what makes their security program the best, and it's information that they only give to customers. They don't post it on their website, they don't share it publicly, and the town only has it because you're a customer. Now it's become a public record, but there's this exemption that says, okay, we don't need to share that third-party information that we got if the only reason we got it is because we're doing business with that entity. And then a lot of these, again, we talked about during the executive session, collective bargaining records, strategy or negotiation around collective bargaining. It could be exempt. The contract itself, once that's arrived, that's public. Records relating to pending claims or litigation. So, a proposed settlement agreement before it's executed, things like that. But really by and large, the law is structured, in favor of disclosure. So what I always tell people is, if you're going to deny an FOI request, you really should be thinking, okay, where in the law, either another state law somewhere or one of these exemptions that are in there, where are the grounds that I'm doing this on? It sounds a little silly sometimes, but I tell people, okay, if you think that, you gotta have a reason, because if someone challenges you on it, if someone files a complaint and you come to the commission, you just say, well, I don't think they should have it. That's not the way the law works. The way the law works is the public is entitled to those records. They're allowed to have copies of them. Again, unless one of those kind of narrow exemptions apply, or if there is a particular another state law somewhere that says otherwise. So we talked a lot about what to do. I'm just going to share a little story of what not to do. So hopefully we don't see this. Yes.
Leading up to a final.
So that may be when we talked about drafts and personal notes. I think that would, depending on the circumstances, that may be kind of where that falls in. I hear that a lot from attorneys, because I know there's attorney work product, but that's not a thing that's defined under FOI. But it could be in that preliminary drafts that we talked about before it goes for a decision to be made. So anyway, as I said, we talked a lot about what to do. Here's a little story, kind of on the other end of the spectrum. So this is a story from Hartford. It goes back, now I think it's 10 or 15 years ago. We talked earlier about how there's no difficult people in the town of Bethel, but in Hartford, they had somebody who was, kind of an antagonist to the city. He had been on the council, and then he had a blog, and he was really active. And so, the corporation council is very familiar with him, but he makes an FOI request, this guy, to the corporation council, and he's asking for copies of some legal bills, and then the checks from the city to pay for those legal bills, right? Public records. Maybe there's legal information on it they could redact, but the city hired an outside attorney. It's public information. It's public records. So the guy makes the request. So the Corporation Counsel writes him back, gives him the 4-day acknowledgement. He says, hey, I have your FOI request. We will coordinate our response. We will provide you with such documentation, that is available to you under the law. So they're doing good so far. The next thing he does is he writes an email to a colleague after he gets his FOI request, after he responds to him, and says, Carl, so who lit a fire under this asshole? Can I shut him down, or can I make him define the projects he is referencing? So basically, how do I not give the guy the records, right? The problem is that he copied the requester on the email. So the requester, who already knew the guy didn't like him, now had something in writing from the guy showing that he clearly didn't like him. He posts it on his blog. It gets picked up by the Hartford Courant. It's on the news and all this. Black eye for the city. The mayor goes to the Corporation Counsel and says, you have to apologize. Corporation Counsel doesn't want to do it, but they say, look, this was really bad. You can't say that in an email, especially not to the guy directly. So then this is his apology letter to this requester. He says, apparently you have little else to do other than to pester me in this office and other city departments. Recall that I do not work for you. This is someone who lives in the city. I would hope that none of you would write to someone who lives in Bethel and say that you don't work for them, because we do work for the people. Recall that I do not work for you. The purpose of the FOIA statute is not to provide you a playground. The guy takes this, posts this online again. So another black eye for Hartford. They don't care about transparency. I can't believe the Corporation Counsel said. Meanwhile, while this is going on, they never give the requester the records because they're so fixated on who he is. He files an FOI complaint. They go to the commission, they lose because they're legal bills. It's public expenditure of funds. So then there's another headline of them losing at the FOI commission. So, this is one of those circumstances where, again, even if it's people that are difficult, even if we see someone coming in and we know it's going to be more work for us, or we're thinking, why are we doing that? It's the law, you have to comply. Don't, put your blinders on. Don't let the requester drive you in a certain direction. Don't get fixated on what they're going to do with the records. If it's public information, if they're public records, and by and large, most of the information that comes into town halls is public, people have a right to it. I did one of these trainings once, and somebody had a really good comment that I like to share is, in a way, shouldn't we be happy that people are interested in what's going on in town? I mean, it's annoying when you're having to go through your emails at 11 o'clock at night for an FOI request, but also, hey, it's a citizen in a town who wants to know about what their government is doing. And that's really what FOI is about. It's about people in your town. They want more information about what you're doing. It's not what they want to do with it or what their motive is. We should sort of be thinking, good of that, right? I mean, good for someone who's coming along and wants to learn more about, what they're doing. So, with that, any other questions on records or anything else that we covered? Yes.
You may have covered this already, but like if we're sitting on a board, as some people are, and 12 years later, can someone track us down and say, we have an FOI for a project that you were sitting on the board for, and you can go through all your emails and.
So again, the key thing with FOI, it's only the records that you have. So if you don't, if you're not on the board anymore and you don't have the records anymore and you delete them or you give them to the town and say, here's my stuff, I don't want it anymore. Again, records retention is a little different because it's Connecticut State Library, but I would look on there and I would think if you were on the board 12 years ago and you deleted the emails or you don't have them anymore, or clear them out. Yeah, it's only what you have. If you don't have a record, even if you're supposed to have it, FOI is not going to do anything. We really want, it's what you have. If you don't have it, you can't find it, you don't know where it is, as long as you're being truthful about it, you looked for it and you couldn't find it or you didn't have it, then, you're okay from an FOI standpoint.
Isn't there a time limit to?
Yeah, that's why I keep saying records retention. It's the Connecticut State Library. There is, I think emails, it's, don't quote me on it, but I think it's like 2 years for most things for emails. But again, if it's a copy or it's a transitory, hey, there's donuts down the hall and, the break room, those things you can delete. I think it's typically 2 years is kind of the period for most emails. But other documents, budget things and things like that get kept longer, so.
You can't find it, so I look for it for 2 hours, like I search and search and search.
So it would, what it would depend on is, if push came to shove and somebody filed a complaint and you came to the commission, we would just be looking to see, did you do what we call a diligent search? So, I went on my computer for half an hour and I typed in, whatever, baseball field project and I couldn't find anything, is a little different versus, okay, I looked on my computer, I looked through my email, I did this, so you want to make a good effort to do it. But if we're not expecting you to spend, a year trying to find something, but look in the places where it would reasonably be, right? Look in your computer at work, look at your computer at home, look through your files. Okay, I didn't find it. That's, again, diligent search is what you should be shooting for.
Russ, I just want to chime in. First off, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for coming out and doing this and taking an interest in FOI because it's super important. One of the things, I don't know if, because I had to step out from the fire department, we have Melanie O'Brien with us here tonight. Melanie O'Brien is our town attorney. So she is also your resource with anything FOI. So you're not alone in this. In fact, I would recommend if you get a call for an FOI, get a hold of Melanie. It's O'Brien m@bethel-ep.gov. If you're a chair of the committee, you should probably have her number, but she'll guide you through the process. Don't worry about it. It's not that hard. But I think tonight you're going to walk away with a lot of stuff to kind of really set that tone. And I would really appreciate it too if you tell your fellow members of the board we're gonna make this available so they can listen to it at some point. Because even I was listening to it in the car on the way over, and I was learning some things that I hadn't even remembered. So I just want to make sure I put that out to you guys.
Yeah, thank
Thank
you.
you.
And then there's some handouts up here if you want to come grab some meetings and records, and then the little packets.
Thank you.
Yeah, good to be here. Yeah, thanks.
A lot of good info. Okay.